February 26, 1959. The Ural Mountains, Soviet Russia. A search party finds a tent on the remote slopes of Kolytsyakhl, a mountain whose name in the local Monsey language means dead mountain. The tent has been cut open from the inside, violently, as if the people inside were desperate to escape. But escape from what? Near the tent, searchers find footprints in the snow. Bare feet, socks, one boot. The prints lead downhill toward the forest, about a mile away. Then the searchers find the first bodies. 2 young men, shoeless, wearing only underwear, lying near the remains of a fire under a cedar tree. They're frozen solid. Their hands are burned, as if they'd been desperately trying to warm themselves. Over the next few months, 7 more bodies will be found. Some partially clothed, scattered between the tent and the forest. Some buried under several feet of snow in a ravine. And the condition of the bodies will defy explanation. One victim has massive chest trauma, ribs fractured, heart damaged, with injuries comparable to a high-speed car crash. But there are no external wounds. No signs of impact. Another has her skull fractured. A third is missing her tongue, eyes, and part of her face. Another has severe chest trauma and is missing his eyes. The Soviet investigators will conclude that the 9 hikers died from a compelling natural force. They'll close the case, classify the files, and seal the area to hikers for 3 years. What happened on Dead Mountain? Why did 9 experienced hikers, healthy, well-equipped, skilled winter mountaineers, cut their way out of their tent in the middle of the night and flee into deadly cold wearing almost no clothing? Why did some have catastrophic internal injuries with no external trauma? Why were some missing body parts? What were the bright lights witnesses reported seeing in the sky that night? This is the Dyatlov Pass incident. 65 years later, we still don't have a definitive answer. And the more you learn about what happened, the stranger it becomes. The expedition was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student at Ural Polytechnic Institute. He was experienced, responsible, and had led multiple winter hiking expeditions before. His group consisted of 9 others, all students or recent graduates, all experienced hikers. Zinaida Kalmogorova, 22 economics student, experienced hiker. Ludmila Dubinina, 20 economics student, strong and enthusiastic. Alexander Kolevatov, 24 physics student. Rustam Slobodin, 23 engineering student. Yuri Georgy Krivonischenko, 23 engineering student. Yuri Doroshenko, 21 economics student. Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, 23 engineering student. Alexander Zolotaryov, 37 the oldest, an experienced mountaineer and instructor. Semyon Zolotaryov, 38 actually the same person as above. Some sources list the name differently. There was also a 10th member, Yuri Yudin, 21. Who had to turn back early due to illness. His decision to leave the group saved his life. He would be the only survivor, and he would spend the rest of his life haunted by what happened to his friends. This wasn't a group of amateurs. These were seasoned winter hikers planning a Category 3 expedition, the second highest difficulty rating, to Otorten Mountain in the northern Urals. They were properly equipped with tents, warm clothing, food, and supplies. The journey begins. The group began their trek on January 27, 1959. They traveled by train, then truck, then on skis into the wilderness. The first few days were uneventful. They were making good progress in good spirits. They documented their journey in photographs and diary entries. On January 28, Yuri Yudin fell ill with sciatica and decided to turn back. The others continued without him. That was the last time anyone saw the group alive. By February 1st, they had reached the eastern slope of Kolytsyakhl Mountain. They were planning to set up camp, rest, and then continue to Otorten the next day. According to their last diary entries and the photographs developed from film found with the bodies, they were in good condition. The weather was harsh, strong winds, snow, temperatures around -25 to -30 degrees Celsius, -13 to -22 degrees Fahrenheit, but nothing these experienced winter hikers couldn't handle. They set up their tent on the mountain slope. According to later analysis, This was an unusual choice. Experienced hikers typically camp in forested areas where there's shelter from wind. Camping on an exposed mountain slope suggested either a navigation error or a deliberate decision for reasons we don't understand. That night, February 1st, something happened. Something that caused 9 experienced hikers to cut their way out of their tent and flee into the deadly cold. Most of them barely dressed. The discovery. When the group failed to return by their expected date of February 12th, their families became concerned. However, delays were common in winter expeditions, so search efforts didn't begin immediately. By February 20th, with still no word from the group, multiple search parties were organized. These included volunteers, fellow students, and hikers, as well as military search and rescue. The area was remote, the weather was harsh, but the searchers were motivated. These were their friends out there. On February 26th, searchers found the tent on the mountain slope. What they saw made no sense. The tent was partially collapsed, covered with snow, but still largely intact. It had been cut open from the inside, multiple long slashes, as if people had been desperately trying to get out. Why not use the entrance? Inside the tent, everything was still there. Warm clothes, boots, supplies, all abandoned. Some personal items were neatly arranged, as if the occupants had been preparing for bed. But then something had caused them to tear through the tent fabric and flee into the night. The searchers found footprints leading downhill toward the forest, about 1.5 kilometers away. 8 or 9 people, some barefoot, some in socks, one wearing a single boot. The prints were relatively orderly at first, suggesting the group had left together, walking, not running, in a somewhat organized manner. This detail is crucial. They weren't running in random panic. They walked away from the tent together as a group in an organized manner, but without stopping to put on their boots or warm clothing. The first bodies. Following the footprints to the forest edge, searchers found the first 2 bodies on February 27th, near a cedar tree. Yuri Krivonischenko and Yuri Doroshenko, the 2 Yuris, were found side by side, wearing only underwear. Both were barefoot. They had frozen to death. Several strange details. The cedar tree showed signs of broken branches up to 5 meters, 16 feet, high, suggesting someone had climbed it. Some branches appeared to be deliberately broken off, possibly to use as firewood or to see something. The men had burns on their hands and legs, consistent with trying to warm themselves at a fire. The remains of a small fire were found nearby. Most bizarrely, their clothing was partially removed or shredded. It appeared that someone had cut or torn clothing off the bodies after death. Between the cedar tree and the tent, searchers found 3 more bodies over the next few days. Igor Dyatlov was found on February 27th, about 300 meters from the cedar, heading back toward the tent. He was better dressed than the 2 Yuris, but still inadequately clothed for the cold. Zinaida Kalmogorova was found on February 28th, about 630 meters from the tent, also heading back uphill. She had abraded knuckles, suggesting she tried to fight or climb something. Rustam Slobodin was found on March 5th, about 480 meters from the tent, also heading back. He had a small skull fracture, though not immediately fatal. The pattern was clear. These 3 had tried to return to the tent after whatever drove them away. They'd made it partway before succumbing to hypothermia. But 4 bodies were still missing. The search continues. The remaining 4 bodies, Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibeaux-Brignoles, and Alexander Zolotaryov, weren't found until May 4, 1959. More than 2 months after the first bodies were discovered. They were located in a ravine in the forest, about 75 meters from the cedar tree, buried under 4 meters, 13 feet of snow. They had made it further from the tent than any of the others, and they'd survived longer. And their injuries were unlike anything the investigators had seen. The inexplicable injuries. When the bodies were examined, the medical examiner documented injuries that became the most controversial and mysterious aspect of the case. Ludmila Dubinina, multiple rib fractures on both sides, massive chest trauma, missing tongue, eyes, part of facial tissue, and part of her lips. No external trauma, no bruises, no lacerations on the skin. Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, major skull fracture with brain damage. Again, no external trauma or soft tissue damage. Alexander Zolotaryov, multiple rib fractures, severe chest trauma, missing eyes, no significant external injuries. Alexander Kolevatov, deformed neck, missing eyebrows, less severe injuries than the other three. The medical examiner noted that the force required to cause such massive internal injuries would have been comparable to the force of a car crash. The rib fractures showed extreme force, multiple ribs broken on both sides, sternum fractured in Dubinina's case. But there were no external wounds, no bruises on the skin, no lacerations, no signs of impact trauma on the surface of the bodies. How do you get internal injuries of that magnitude with no external trauma? The clothing mystery. The ravine bodies were better dressed than those found earlier. They were wearing multiple layers, including clothing that had been taken from the other victims. Dubinina was wearing Krivonischenko's pants, one of the two Yuris found by the cedar. Zolotaryov was wearing Dubinina's faux fur coat and hat. This indicates that after the two Yuris died by the cedar tree, the survivors removed their clothing to help keep themselves warm. A rational survival decision. It means the ravine group survived long enough to scavenge clothing from the dead. But some of the clothing showed strange damage. Pieces were cut or torn away. Some showed signs of radiation contamination when tested, though this finding is disputed and might be from natural sources or contamination during testing. The tent mystery. Back at the tent site, investigators conducted a thorough examination. What they found didn't answer questions, it created more. The tent had been properly set up and secured. The cuts from the inside were clear and deliberate, not tears from animal claws or wind damage. Someone had slashed through the tent fabric with a knife or sharp object. Inside, everything was relatively organized. Boots lined up, jackets hanging, food supplies intact, personal items in place. This wasn't the scene of a sudden attack that caused panic. It looked like people had been settling in for the night, yet something made them cut through the tent and flee wearing almost nothing. Several investigators noted that the tent showed some damage on the top, possibly from wind or snow accumulation, but that wouldn't explain the internal cuts or the flight from the tent. The official investigation. The Soviet investigation was extensive, involving multiple medical examiners, forensic specialists, and investigators. They conducted autopsies, took photographs, examined the scene, and interviewed witnesses and experts. Their findings included cause of death. 6 died from hypothermia. 3, the ravine victims with severe injuries, died from major trauma. Findings: no evidence of foul play from other humans. No signs of combat or struggle with other people. No evidence of animal attack. The internal injuries were caused by an unknown compelling force. The tent was cut from the inside by the victims themselves. On May 28, 1959, the investigation was officially closed. The conclusion was vague and unsatisfying. The hikers died from a compelling natural force which the hikers were unable to overcome. Then the case files were sent to a secret archive. The area was closed to hikers for 3 years, and rumors began to spread. The radiation finding. One detail that has fueled conspiracy theories. Some of the clothing tested positive for radiation. Specifically, Dubinina's clothing showed beta particle radiation levels that were elevated above normal background. Kolevatov's clothing also showed some elevation. What does this mean? It's unclear. Possible explanations. Natural sources. The area has naturally occurring radioactive minerals. Prolonged contact with certain rocks or soil could cause contamination. Contamination during testing. The testing occurred months after the bodies were found. Contamination during handling or testing is possible. Professional exposure. Krivonischenko worked at a nuclear facility. His clothing might have had residual contamination that transferred to others when they wore his clothes. Unknown source, or something else happened that exposed them to radiation. The radiation finding is often cited as evidence of something extraordinary. A weapons test, an alien encounter, a radioactive event. But the levels detected were not immediately lethal, and the finding is inconsistent. Not all clothing was tested, and not all tested clothing showed elevation. Theory 1. Avalanche. The most recent official explanation, proposed by Russian authorities in 2019, is that a small avalanche or snow slab collapse occurred. The argument: strong winds created unstable snow conditions on the mountain slope. A delayed snow slab collapsed onto the tent, explaining the damage to the top. The hikers, fearing burial, cut their way out and fled downslope. They couldn't return because the tent was partially buried or unstable. They tried to survive in the forest but succumbed to hypothermia. The severe internal injuries came from being caught in the snow collapse. Problems with this theory: experienced hikers would know not to camp in avalanche-prone areas. The tent was found relatively intact, not buried. Avalanche injuries typically show external trauma. These bodies didn't. Why flee so far? Why not dig out the tent or wait nearby? The footprints showed organized walking, not panic or people being swept downslope. No significant avalanche debris was documented at the scene. The slope angle, about 15 to 20 degrees, is generally too gentle for avalanches. A 2021 scientific paper attempted to explain the injuries using snow slab dynamics, but many experts remain skeptical. Theory 2. Infrasound. Infrasound is low-frequency sound below the range of human hearing. It can be generated by wind moving over mountains and has been shown to cause feelings of anxiety, fear, and even panic in humans. The argument: strong winds creating infrasound on the mountain slope caused the hikers to experience intense, irrational fear. They fled the tent in a panic, without rational thought, driven by overwhelming anxiety induced by the infrasound. The severe injuries came from falls or other accidents in the dark. Problems with this theory: infrasound might cause anxiety, but compelling people to flee into deadly cold seems extreme. The organized nature of their departure, walking together, not scattered panic, doesn't fit with irrational fear. Doesn't explain the specific pattern of injuries. Why did only some have severe injuries while others had none? Infrasound effects are temporary. Why didn't they return to the tent once away from it? Theory 3. Military test or accident. Some theorists suggest the hikers encountered a military test, a missile, weapon, or aircraft test that went wrong. The argument: the area was near military installations. Witnesses reported seeing bright orange spheres or lights in the sky around that time. Perhaps the hikers witnessed a military test, were exposed to something, hence radiation on clothing, or were caught in a weapons test. The military covered it up. Problems with this theory: no physical evidence of military activity at the scene. Why would a military test cause people to flee their tent but then survive long enough to build a fire, climb trees, and walk around? Why the specific pattern of injuries? Soviet military typically used more remote areas for sensitive tests. The cover-up would require extensive coordination. However, the reported lights in the sky and the rapid classification of files do add some credibility to this theory. Theory 4. Paradoxical undressing. This is a known phenomenon in severe hypothermia. As the body's core temperature drops, people paradoxically feel hot and remove their clothing, accelerating their death. The argument: the hikers left the tent for some reason, maybe avalanche fear, maybe wind damage, got separated from their supplies and began succumbing to hypothermia. Paradoxical undressing explains why they removed clothing. Problems with this theory: paradoxical undressing occurs in the final stages of hypothermia, when cognitive function is severely impaired. The hikers' actions, building a fire, climbing a tree, attempting to return to the tent, show cognitive function. This doesn't explain why they left the tent in the first place. Doesn't explain the severe internal injuries on some bodies. The clothing removal appears more deliberate than the confused stripping of paradoxical undressing. Theory 5. Katabatic winds. Katabatic winds are sudden, powerful downdrafts of cold air on mountain slopes. They can reach high speeds and create dangerous conditions. The argument: a sudden katabatic wind event damaged their tent, created dangerous conditions, and forced them to flee. The wind continued, preventing their return. They tried to survive in the forest but couldn't. Problems with this theory. Experienced hikers would understand katabatic winds. Why cut the tent instead of using the entrance? Doesn't explain the severe internal injuries. The weather that night, while cold and windy, wasn't extraordinarily extreme. Theory 6. Animal attack or panic. Perhaps they fled from a perceived threat. A bear, wolves, or even just sounds that frightened them in the night. The argument. In the darkness and wind, normal sounds might have seemed threatening. They fled, got disoriented, couldn't find their way back to the tent, and succumbed to the cold. Problems with this theory. No animal tracks were found. Experienced winter hikers would be familiar with animal sounds. Why not take the time to put on boots? The organized nature of their departure doesn't fit panic. Doesn't explain the severe injuries. Theory 7. Combination of factors. Many researchers now believe the answer involves multiple factors working together. The argument. Perhaps there was an initial triggering event, wind damage to tent, snow accumulation, strange sounds, causing them to exit the tent hurriedly. Once outside in inadequate clothing in -25°C weather, they faced a survival crisis. They couldn't immediately return to the tent. Too far, too dark, too cold. They tried to survive in the forest, building a fire. Some climbed the tree to see if they could spot the tent or get bearings. The severe injuries came from falls in the dark. Falling from the tree, falling into the ravine. The snow in the ravine was deep. A fall onto hard snow could cause massive internal injuries without external wounds. Hypothermia, falls, and poor decisions under stress combined to create the tragedy. This theory's strengths. Doesn't require extraordinary events. Explains most elements of the case. Consistent with known human behavior under stress. Accounts for the sequence of events. Remaining questions. What initially drove them from the tent? Why cut it rather than use the entrance? Can falls really cause those injuries without external trauma? What we know for certain. Despite all the theories, some facts are not disputed. 9 experienced hikers died on the night of February 1st to 2nd, 1959. They cut their way out of their tent from the inside. They fled wearing inadequate clothing for the conditions. They walked in an organized manner initially. Some attempted to return to the tent. 3 suffered massive internal trauma with minimal external injuries. The Soviet investigation found no evidence of foul play. The case was quickly closed and classified. What the survivors say. Yuri Yudin, the only survivor who turned back before the incident, spent decades trying to understand what happened to his friends. He participated in investigations, gave interviews, and considered various theories. In his later years, he came to believe it was a combination of natural factors, probably something related to weather conditions, possibly a small snow slab or wind damage, that caused them to leave the tent, followed by a series of tragic decisions and accidents in the dark and cold. He rejected conspiracy theories and supernatural explanations. He believed his friends encountered a natural danger they couldn't overcome, and poor decisions under stress led to tragedy. Yudin died in 2013, never getting a definitive answer. The 2019 official closure. In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the investigation under pressure from relatives of the victims. After reviewing evidence and consulting experts, they concluded the deaths were caused by an avalanche or snow slab. The families were not satisfied. Many experts disagreed. The debate continues. Why this case endures? The Dyatlov Pass incident has become one of the most famous unsolved mysteries because it combines several elements. Unusual setting, remote Siberian wilderness in winter, adding to the mystique. Experienced victims. These weren't inexperienced adventurers. They knew what they were doing. Physical evidence. The cut tent, the footprints, the bodies, everything is documented but still puzzling. Inexplicable injuries. The internal trauma without external wounds remains the most mysterious element. Official secrecy. The quick classification of files-fueled conspiracy theories. Multiple plausible theories. Unlike some mysteries, Dyatlov Pass has several theories that could explain parts of what happened. Modern resonance. In an age where we expect technology and science to explain everything, An unsolved 65-year-old case is deeply unsettling. The lessons. What does the Dyatlov Pass incident teach us? Nature is dangerous. Even experienced, well-equipped people can die in wilderness situations when things go wrong. We don't have all the answers. Despite forensic science, investigations, and decades of analysis, some events remain mysterious. Small decisions matter, whatever caused them to leave that tent, whether reasonable or panicked. That single decision led to 9 deaths. In extreme conditions, there's no room for error. The truth might be mundane. The most likely explanation might be a combination of unfortunate circumstances, not an exotic weapon or supernatural event. But mundane doesn't mean less tragic. Mystery attracts mythology. In the absence of definitive answers, people create narratives. The Dyatlov Pass incident has inspired books, films, conspiracy theories, and countless debates. Sometimes the mystery becomes more important than the truth. The memorial. Today, the pass where the hikers died is called Dyatlov Pass in Igor Dyatlov's honor. There's a memorial plaque. Hikers still visit the site, retracing the group's final journey. The tent location, the cedar tree, the ravine, these places have become pilgrimage sites for those fascinated by the mystery. Each year, someone attempts a recreation of the trek, trying to understand what the hikers experienced, what they saw, what might have frightened them. The victims are buried in Ekaterinburg. Their graves are visited by people who never knew them but feel connected to their story. The most likely explanation. After examining all evidence and theories, what probably happened? Most likely, the hikers left their tent due to some perceived immediate danger. Possibly snow accumulation damaging the tent, possibly frightening sounds in the wind, possibly some combination of factors that seemed threatening in the moment. They cut their way out quickly rather than using the entrance. Perhaps the entrance was blocked by snow, or perhaps in their urgency they simply reacted by cutting through the nearest wall. Once outside in inadequate clothing in -25°C weather, they faced an immediate survival crisis. They couldn't return to the tent immediately. It was too far in the blinding snow and dark, or they feared the danger that drove them out was still present. They moved to the forest to seek shelter and start a fire. Some climbed the cedar tree, possibly to spot the tent or get bearings. Some attempted to return to the tent but succumbed to hypothermia before reaching it. The ravine group, better dressed with scavenged clothing, survived longer but suffered fatal injuries. Probably from a fall into the ravine in the dark, where the snow was deep but underlaid with rocks or ice. A fall from height onto packed snow or ice could cause massive internal trauma without external bruising. This explanation requires no conspiracies, no weapons tests, no supernatural events. Just a series of unfortunate decisions under stress, compounded by harsh conditions and darkness. The enduring questions. But even this most likely explanation leaves questions. What exactly drove them from the tent? Why did they cut through rather than use the entrance? How did 3 people suffer such similar massive internal injuries? These questions may never be answered definitively. The evidence is cold, literally and figuratively. The witnesses are all dead. The scene was contaminated by weather and searchers before proper forensic examination. Sometimes the universe doesn't provide neat answers. Sometimes tragedy is random, its causes unknowable in retrospect. The real mystery, perhaps the real mystery of Dyatlov Pass isn't what happened that night. Perhaps it's why we need to know. Why does this story haunt us? Why have millions of people around the world become fascinated with 9 hikers who died in Siberia in 1959? Maybe it's because their story reminds us how fragile we are, how quickly things can go wrong, how even experience, preparation, and caution can't always save us. Or maybe it's because we want to believe that every mystery has an answer, that every question can be solved, that the universe makes sense. And when we encounter a story that resists explanation, it unsettles something deep within us. On February 1st, 1959, 9 people walked into the Siberian wilderness. They were young, experienced, optimistic about their adventure. Something happened on that mountain slope. Something made them cut their way out of their tent and flee into the deadly cold. Something that 9 capable people couldn't survive. We may never know exactly what. And 65 years later, on that remote mountain slope in the Urals, The wind still howls through Dead Mountain, keeping its secrets.